The holiday season was in full swing, and Jack's office was buzzing with excitement for their annual Christmas party. This year was different, though families were invited to join the celebration. Jack was thrilled by the idea of introducing his wife, Clara, to his colleagues and showing her the vibrant atmosphere of his workplace. "It'll be fun," Jack said one evening as they sat in their cozy living room, the fireplace crackling softly. "You'll finally get to meet everyone I've been talking about." Clara hesitated, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her mug. She wasn't sure why she felt uneasy about attending. Maybe it was the prospect of being surrounded by strangers, or perhaps it was the knowledge that Jack's boss, Mr. Avery, would be there. Clara had always found Mr. Avery charming, perhaps too charming. "I'll think about it," Clara said with a small smile, hoping Jack would let the subject drop. But Jack's enthusiasm was contagious. Over the next few days, he kept bringing up the party, describing the decorations, the food, and the live band they'd hired. Finally, Clara relented. "All right," she said. "I'll come." Jack's face lit up. "You're going to love it," he said. "I'll introduce you to Mr. Avery. He's been a great mentor to me." Clara's stomach twisted slightly at the mention of Jack's boss, but she pushed the feeling aside. The night of the party arrived, and Clara spent extra time getting ready. She chose a sleek red dress that hugged her figure, paired with delicate silver earrings. When she emerged from the bedroom, Jack's jaw dropped. "You look stunning," he said, pulling her into a quick kiss. "Everyone's going to be jealous of me tonight." Clara laughed, but her nerves lingered as they drove to the office building. The lobby had been transformed into a winter wonderland, complete with twinkling lights, a towering Christmas tree, and tables laden with festive treats. Jack's colleagues greeted them warmly, and Clara began to relax. It didn't take long for Mr. Avery to make his presence known. Tall and confident, with a charming smile that seemed permanently fixed on his face, he commanded attention wherever he went. When Jack introduced Clara to him, Mr. Avery's eyes lingered on her for a moment too long. "So this is the lovely Clara I've heard so much about," he said, extending his hand. Clara shook it, feeling a spark of unease at the intensity of his gaze. "It's nice to meet you," she said politely. "The pleasure's all mine," Mr. Avery replied smoothly. Jack beamed, oblivious to the subtle tension. "Clara's been looking forward to meeting everyone. She's heard so much about you." "I hope I live up to the stories," Mr. Avery said with a wink. As the evening progressed, Clara found herself the focus of Mr. Avery's attention. He seemed to appear wherever she was, striking up conversations and complimenting her on everything from her dress to her sense of humor. Clara tried to brush it off as harmless charm, but the intensity of his interest unsettled her. Jack, meanwhile, was having the time of his life. He moved through the crowd with ease, laughing and joking with his co-workers. Clara watched him from across the room, a pang of guilt gnawing at her. She felt like she was hiding something, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. It wasn't long before the wine began to flow, and Clara's nerves started to fade. The music grew louder, and people crowded the dance floor, their laughter filling the air. Mr. Avery took the opportunity to approach Clara once again. "You seem to be having a good time," he said, his voice low. "I am," Clara replied, though her smile felt forced. "It's a lovely party." "We aim to please," Mr. Avery said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Would you mind joining me in my office for a moment? There's something I'd like to show you." Clara hesitated, glancing around for Jack. He was deep in conversation with a group of co-workers, his laughter ringing out above the music. "It'll only take a minute," Mr. Avery said, his tone persuasive. Before Clara could think of an excuse, he placed a gentle hand on her elbow and guided her toward the office wing. The office was quiet, a stark contrast to the lively party outside. Mr. Avery closed the door behind them, the lock clicking softly into place. Clara's heart raced as she turned to face him. "What did you want to show me?" she asked, her voice unsteady. Mr. Avery stepped closer, his smile predatory. "Just how much I admire you," he said. Clara's breath caught as he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. She knew it was wrong, but the mix of flattery and intoxication clouded her judgment. The moment spiraled into something she hadn't anticipated, leaving her shaken and conflicted. When Clara returned to the party, she felt like a different person. Jack greeted her with a warm smile, oblivious to what had just transpired. Clara forced herself to act normal, but the weight of her actions hung heavily over her. The night ended with laughter and goodbyes, but for Clara, it was only the beginning of a web of deceit that would soon spiral out of control. The days following the Christmas party were a blur for Clara. Her mind replayed the events of that night in excruciating detail. She had convinced herself that it was a lapse in judgment, fueled by wine and the holiday cheer, but the memory of what had happened in Mr. Avery's office lingered like a shadow over her. Jack, on the other hand, was oblivious to Clara's turmoil. He couldn't stop talking about the party, recounting how much fun it was to see his co-workers' families and how proud he was to have Clara by his side. "Everyone loved you," he said one morning over breakfast, his eyes shining with admiration. Mr. Avery even mentioned how impressed he was. Clara's stomach churned at the mention of Jack's boss. She forced a smile, hiding her discomfort. "That's nice of him to say." Mr. Avery, however, was not content to let their encounter remain a one-time mistake. 2 days after the party, he called Jack into his office for a meeting. Jack, eager to make a good impression, didn't think twice about accepting. What he didn't know was that Mr. Avery had orchestrated the meeting as a pretext to visit Jack's house later that evening. "You have a beautiful family," Mr. Avery said as he wrapped up their discussion. "It was a pleasure meeting Clara. She's truly remarkable." Jack beamed at the compliment. "Thank you. She's amazing." That evening, as Jack and Clara were finishing dinner, the doorbell rang. Jack answered it, surprised to find Mr. Avery standing on the porch with a bottle of wine in hand. "Mr. Avery," Jack said, startled. "What brings you here?" "I thought I'd stop by to discuss some ideas we didn't get to cover earlier," Mr. Avery said smoothly. "And I wanted to thank you and Clara again for attending the party. It was a pleasure having you there." Jack stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. Clara, who had been clearing the table, froze when she saw their unexpected guest. "Clara," Mr. Avery said warmly, his eyes locking onto hers. "It's good to see you again." "Hello," Clara replied, her voice tight. She avoided his gaze, focusing on stacking plates as her heart pounded in her chest. The evening unfolded awkwardly. Mr. Avery and Jack discussed work while Clara lingered in the background, pretending to be busy. Every now and then, Mr. Avery would glance at her, his expression unreadable. When Jack stepped out of the room to check on something, Mr. Avery seized the opportunity. "You've been avoiding me," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only Clara could hear. "I don't know what you're talking about," Clara replied, keeping her back to him as she washed dishes. "You do," he said, stepping closer. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about that night." Clara's hands trembled as she set a plate down. "It was a mistake," she whispered. "It can't happen again." Mr. Avery smirked. "Mistakes are only mistakes if we regret them. And I don't." Before Clara could respond, Jack returned, his cheerful demeanor cutting through the tension. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, oblivious to what he had walked in on. "Of course," Mr. Avery said smoothly, turning back to Jack with a practiced smile. "Just admiring how lucky you are to have such a dedicated wife." Jack laughed, missing the way Clara's face flushed with guilt. Over the next few days, Mr. Avery's visits became more frequent. He always had a reason: work discussions, dropping off files, or just passing by. Jack welcomed him with open arms, flattered by the attention from his boss. Clara, however, grew more anxious with each visit. The guilt of her actions weighed heavily on her, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward Mr. Avery. His confidence, his charm, and the secrecy of their connection created a dangerous allure that she couldn't seem to resist. One afternoon, as Jack worked late, Mr. Avery stopped by unannounced. Clara hesitated before letting him in, her heart racing. "We need to talk," she said firmly, but he silenced her with a kiss, his hands gripping her waist. "You don't want me to leave," he said, his voice a mix of persuasion and certainty. Clara's resolve crumbled as the door closed behind them, sealing her fate in a web of deceit that was growing more tangled by the day. The cracks in Clara's life began to widen after Mr. Avery's repeated visits. She tried to keep up appearances, but the guilt of her actions and the looming danger of discovery weighed heavily on her. Each encounter with Mr. Avery brought a mix of excitement and dread, leaving her torn between the thrill of the affair and the fear of losing everything. Jack, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware. He often spoke of how lucky he felt to have a wife who got along so well with his boss. "Mr. Avery seems to really value you," Jack said one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. "He's been so supportive of my work lately. I think I might be in line for a promotion." Clara forced a smile, her chest tightening. She hated the deception but couldn't bring herself to end things with Mr. Avery. His attention was intoxicating, and his persistence made it difficult to resist. One day, Jack's co-worker, Sarah, approached him at the office with a curious expression. "Hey, Jack," she said, lowering her voice. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Jack replied, setting down his coffee mug. Sarah hesitated. "Did you notice anything unusual at the Christmas party? Between Mr. Avery and Clara, I mean." Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" "It's probably nothing," Sarah said quickly. "I just thought I saw them talking alone for a while. They seemed close." Jack laughed, brushing off her comment. "Mr. Avery's just friendly. And Clara was probably being polite. You know how she is." But Sarah's words lingered in Jack's mind. That night, as he lay in bed next to Clara, he couldn't shake the unease her comment had stirred. The tension escalated when Jack came home early one afternoon to find Mr. Avery's car parked in their driveway. He frowned, confused. Clara hadn't mentioned anything about Mr. Avery stopping by. When he entered the house, he heard muffled voices coming from the living room. "Jack?" Clara called out, her voice overly bright as she appeared in the doorway. "I didn't expect you home so early." Jack's eyes darted past her to see Mr. Avery standing by the fireplace, holding a glass of wine. "What's going on?" Jack asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. "Mr. Avery stopped by to discuss some work things," Clara said quickly. "We were just wrapping up." Mr. Avery nodded, his expression calm and composed. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said smoothly. "I'll be on my way." Jack watched as Mr. Avery left, his unease growing. Something about the interaction didn't sit right with him. That evening, Jack's suspicions deepened when he noticed Clara's phone buzzing with a message from an unknown number. She quickly turned the screen away, her face flushing. "Who was that?" Jack asked casually. "Just Sarah," Clara lied. "She was asking about the PTA meeting." Jack nodded, but the nagging feeling in his gut grew stronger. He decided to keep an eye on things, determined to get to the bottom of his unease. Clara, unaware of Jack's growing suspicions, continued to meet with Mr. Avery. The secrecy and the risk only added to the allure, but she couldn't ignore the mounting pressure. Every glance from Jack, every innocent question, felt like an interrogation. One evening, Clara and Mr. Avery met at a quiet restaurant under the guise of discussing Jack's career. They sat in a secluded corner, their conversation low and intimate. "We need to be more careful," Clara said, her voice tinged with worry. Jack starting to ask questions. "Let him," Mr. Avery replied with a smirk. "He has no idea, and he never will." Clara wasn't so sure. The weight of her lies was becoming unbearable, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. That time came sooner than she expected. One afternoon, Jack decided to borrow Clara's car to run an errand. As he adjusted the seat, he noticed a folded piece of paper tucked between the console and the passenger seat. Curious, he unfolded it. It was a handwritten note, unmistakably from Mr. Avery. "Clara, I can't stop thinking about you. Let's meet again soon." "Same place?" Jack's hands trembled as he reread the note. The betrayal was undeniable. His world, the life he had built with Clara, began to crumble around him. He put the note back, his mind racing. Confronting Clara now would only give her time to come up with excuses. Instead, he decided to gather more evidence, determined to confront her and Mr. Avery with the full truth. The aftermath of that discovery set the stage for the unraveling of their lives, as Jack prepared to face the devastating reality of Clara's betrayal. Jack couldn't sleep. The note from Mr. Avery played over and over in his mind, a cruel confirmation of his worst fears. Clara's distant behavior, Mr. Avery's frequent visits, the hushed conversations, it all made sense now. But knowing wasn't enough, he needed undeniable proof. The next morning, Jack left for work early, pretending everything was fine. But instead of heading to the office, he parked near their house, determined to find out what Clara and Mr. Avery were hiding. Hours passed before Mr. Avery's sleek black car pulled into the driveway. Jack's chest tightened as he watched Clara greet him at the door, her expression a mix of nervousness and excitement. They disappeared inside, and Jack waited, his pulse pounding. After what felt like an eternity, he crept to the house and positioned himself near the living room window. The curtains were partially drawn, but he could see enough to confirm his suspicions. Clara and Mr. Avery were seated close together, their conversation filled with lingering glances and touches that left no room for doubt. Jack pulled out his phone, snapping photos and recording video. The anger he felt was like nothing he'd ever experienced before, but he forced himself to stay calm. Bursting in now would only escalate the situation, and he wanted to confront them with irrefutable evidence. That evening, Jack confronted Clara. She was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when he walked in and placed the note on the counter. "What's this?" he asked, his voice steady but cold. Clara froze, her eyes darting to the note. "Jack, I can explain." "Don't," Jack said, cutting her off. "I've seen enough. I know about you and Mr. Avery. I saw him here today." Clara's face turned pale. "Jack, please, it's not what you think." "It's exactly what I think," Jack snapped. He pulled out his phone and showed her the photos and videos. "How long has this been going on?" Tears welled in Clara's eyes. "I never meant for it to happen," she whispered. "It was a mistake." "A mistake?" Jack's voice rose. "Mistakes don't last for weeks. Mistakes don't involve sneaking around and lying to your husband." Clara broke down, sobbing. "I'm so sorry, Jack. I don't know what I was thinking." Jack stared at her, his anger giving way to a deep, aching sadness. "You weren't thinking about me. Or our family. That's what hurts the most." The confrontation didn't end there. Jack went to Mr. Avery's office the next day, his emotions barely in check. He waited until most of the staff had left for lunch, then stormed into Mr. Avery's office without knocking. "Jack," Mr. Avery said, feigning surprise. "What can I do for you?" "You can start by explaining why you've been sleeping with my wife," Jack said, his voice low but filled with fury. Mr. Avery's confident demeanor faltered for a moment before he recovered. "Jack, I think you're misunderstanding the situation." "Save it," Jack interrupted, slamming his phone on the desk and playing the video. "You think I'm an idiot? You think I wouldn't find out?" Mr. Avery sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Look, Jack, I'm sorry. It wasn't personal." "Not personal?" Jack's voice rose. "You destroyed my marriage, and you're telling me it wasn't personal?" The tension in the room was suffocating. Mr. Avery's calm facade began to crack as Jack's anger boiled over. "I'm done here," Jack said finally, his voice trembling with emotion. "You can keep your apologies. They mean nothing to me." Back at home, Jack began making preparations to file for divorce. The betrayal had cut too deep, and there was no salvaging their relationship. Clara begged for another chance, promising to end things with Mr. Avery and do whatever it took to make amends. "I can't," Jack said, his voice heavy with sadness. "I don't trust you anymore. And without trust, there's nothing left." Clara's sobs echoed through the house as Jack packed a bag and left for a few days to clear his head. The reality of what had happened was sinking in, and he knew the road ahead would be painful. But he also knew it was the only way forward. The fallout from Clara's affair would ripple through their lives in ways neither of them could have anticipated. And for Jack, the discovery marked the beginning of a journey toward healing and rebuilding the life he thought he had lost. The days following Jack's confrontation with Clara were marked by a haunting silence. The once warm home they had built together felt cold and empty. Jack stayed with a friend while he began preparing for the inevitable divorce. Clara, left alone in the house, grappled with the consequences of her actions. The guilt was unbearable, and every corner of the home served as a reminder of the life she had destroyed. She reached out to Jack daily, sending texts and leaving voicemails, begging for a chance to explain, to fix things, to make amends. "Please, Jack," one voicemail said, her voice breaking. "I'll do anything. I made a terrible mistake, but I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you." But Jack didn't respond. The betrayal had cut too deep, and he wasn't ready to face her pleas. Instead, he focused on moving forward. The divorce proceedings were swift. Jack's lawyer filed on grounds of infidelity, and with the evidence Jack had collected, there was little room for dispute. Clara initially resisted, pleading for counseling and reconciliation, but she eventually realized that Jack's decision was final. "I'll never forgive myself for this," Clara said during one of their meetings with the lawyers. Her voice was hollow, her eyes red from crying. Jack didn't reply. He couldn't. The pain of her betrayal was still too fresh, and any words he might have spoken would have only reopened the wound. Mr. Avery's involvement in the affair didn't remain a secret for long. Jack's confrontation at the office had been overheard by a few co-workers, and rumors spread quickly. Within weeks, the scandal had reached upper management, and Mr. Avery was asked to step down. The professional fallout was significant, and Mr. Avery's reputation in the industry was irreparably damaged. As for Clara, she found herself ostracized by their social circle. Friends who had once admired her now avoided her, and the shame of her actions followed her everywhere. She moved to a small apartment on the outskirts of town, far from the life she had once known. Jack, meanwhile, focused on rebuilding his life. He poured himself into his work, his friendships, and his hobbies, rediscovering parts of himself that had been lost in the chaos of his marriage. He sought therapy to process the betrayal, finding solace in the guidance of a compassionate counselor. "You're stronger than you think," the counselor told him during one session. "This is a chapter in your life, not the whole story. There's so much more ahead of you." Those words stayed with Jack, becoming a beacon of hope as he navigated the difficult path of healing. Months turned into a year, and Jack began to find peace. He rekindled old friendships, traveled to places he'd always wanted to see, and even started dating again. While the scars of Clara's betrayal remained, they no longer defined him. He had grown stronger, wiser, and more resilient. One evening, as Jack sat on the porch of his new home, sipping a cup of tea and watching the sun set, he received an unexpected message from Clara. It was a short note, filled with remorse. Jack. I've spent the last year thinking about everything I did to you, to us. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I threw it away. I hope you found happiness again. Clara *. Jack read the message twice before setting his phone down. He didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. The affair that had once shattered Jack's world now felt like a distant memory, a painful chapter that had ultimately led him to a better place. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Jack smiled. The future was his, and he was finally free to embrace it.